Greetings and welcome to the next in our sequence of videos about Dunkirk. And on this one we're going to be having a look at the evacuation from the ground pounder's perspective. To set the stage, go back to the 20th of May 1940, where you have soldiers in the leading units of the Wehrmacht's 2nd Panzer Division gazing upon the English Channel at Noyelles-sur-Mer. It's about 100 kilometers west of Dunkirk. The campaign had only been going for 10 days, but in a mere 240 hours, Hitler's panzers had rushed through the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest, smashed the French defences at Sedan and along the Meuse River, and then slashed their way across France, tearing the Allied armies in two. On the southern side of the German penetration lay the bulk of the French army desperately trying to reform a new battle line along the Somme River. To the north lay the now cut off Belgian army, the French First Army, much of the remnants of the French 7th and 9th Armies, and Lord Gort's British Expeditionary Force, the BEF. After a series of ineffectual counterattacks on the 21st and 22nd of May failed to re-establish a corridor between the two Allied forces, the trapped armies began backing their way towards the coast, intent on building a defensive perimeter around the Channel ports in the hope that this would allow the Royal Navy to indefinitely sustain a powerful bridgehead on the continent. At least this is what the French thought were going to happen. Lord Gort, on the other hand, was already planning on how to evacuate the BEF and save it from extermination in France. To do so, what Gort needed more than anything was time. General Guderian's Panzer Corps was already in his rear, and Gort understood that if he failed to build a new defensive line along the Canal, the BEF was doomed. But time was one thing that Guderian was determined not to offer. By nightfall of the 22nd of May, after a staggering 60-mile advance in a single day, 2nd Panzer was at the gates of Boulogne, while its sister unit, the 10th Panzer, was already hammering away at Calais. In a desperate bid to buy time, the British pushed troops straight from the parade grounds in Britain to these cities, many of them arriving just hours ahead of the Germans. These hastily dispatched units fought valiantly, but those in Boulogne, given no time to prepare defense, were soon overwhelmed. At Calais, however, Brigadier Claude Nicholson's men fought a tenacious house-to-house battle, which hugely upset the German timetable. But by the 25th of May, it was clear that Nicholson's exhausted force was nearly spent. A final cable reached them close to midnight. Every hour that you continue to exist is of the greatest help to the BEF. Government has therefore decided that you must continue to fight. Have the greatest admiration for your splendid stand. If this is the Yes Prime Minister episode, I'll be saying that in a Churchill voice, but I don't really have a good Churchill voice. Anyway, after 3 days and nights of incessant attacks by artillery, tanks, Stukas, so on, Calais' defenders had nothing to give, and on the 26th of May, Nicholson and his men were marched off into captivity. Even before Calais' fall, substantial amounts of Guderian's panzers had begun bypassing the city and heading to the Canal. By the 24th, Guderian and General Reinhardt, commanding the Panzer Corps on Guderian's right, had secured several bridgeheads across the Aar and were poised to strike for Dunkirk, a mere 20 kilometers or so from Gravelines, the Canal crossing there. With Dunkirk in German hands, the BEF's inglorious fate would be sealed. As Guderian poured forces into his bridgeheads, expecting to lunge forward at dawn, Hitler came to the BEF's rescue. By the Führer's order, supporting Reinhardt, the panzers were stopped at the Aar and forbidden to advance further. Dunkirk would be left to the Luftwaffe. The BEF had been granted a reprieve and time to build that golden bridge to Britain. For 2 days, the panzers idled and maintained, while the Luftwaffe pounded on Dunkirk. On just the first day, 300 level and Stuka bomber sorties dropped over 350 tons of bombs. First came the waves of Heinkel 111s. Starting at dawn and continuing until noon, the Heinkels pulverized the then flourishing port. When they finally departed, the harbour was a scene of total devastation. About 5 miles of quays were wrecked, all 7 docking basins were in ruin, and over 100 acres of docklands and warehouses were burning. Succeeding waves of bombers sank several ships that were lying just offshore, wrecked the railway yards, set fire to the city centre and left the St. Paul refinery in flames. 1,000 French civilians lay dead, and the smoke from the flames, particularly from the refinery, burned for over a week, sending a beacon of oily smoke 12,000 feet in the air. The plumes drew in not only the retreating BEF, but over nearly the next 2 weeks they became the focus of successive airstrikes. Along with June the 1st, this attack marked one of only 2 good days for the Luftwaffe. Worn down by 3 weeks of non-stop operations, flying at the extreme limits of their range, and starting to suffer from maintenance problems, the Luftwaffe was never able to dominate the skies the way they did in the early phases of the German invasion. Over Dunkirk, they were met by nearly the full force of the Royal Air Force, which finally committed the squadrons it had held back from the debacle in France. Often hampered by fog and low ceilings and the smoke from the fires, the Luftwaffe, for the first time, found itself fighting for its life. In just 9 days, British fighters, flying from just over the Channel and Dover and surrounding areas, flew almost 3,000 sorties, pilots often flying 3 or 4 missions a day. The Luftwaffe certainly had some successes, but they could not stop and were barely able to slow the embarkation off Dunkirk's beaches. Far from being able to destroy the BEF, Goering's vaunted air fleets had to make a maximum effort to have any effect at all. On the 25th of May, General Maurice Jean Blanchard, now commanding France's First Army and having at least nominal control of the BEF and Belgian forces, ordered the withdrawal to a line demarcated by the Canal, the Lys River, and the Canal de Evacuation. His plan was to hold the bastion around Dunkirk for as long as the war lasted, or, failing that, to employ all Allied forces in a glorious last stand against the German panzers. Blanchard still had no idea that the British cabinet was about to order the BEF to depart the continent, or, for that matter, that Leopold, King of the Belgians, was on the verge of surrendering his country and its army. On the 26th of May, the halt order on the panzers was lifted, and Guderian's, Reinhardt's, and Hoth's panzer corps immediately began preparations to make the final drive east into the still retreating BEF. The BEF was reeling backwards and for the most part a long way from the coast. To buy them a little bit more time, Gort did his best to beef up the western defensive line, including employing the French 68th Division, which went into the line near Gravelines. Even with this French aid, Gort never had enough troops to build a solid defensive line. Instead, he opted for a series of strong points that, if they couldn't stop the Germans, would hopefully delay them enough for the rest of the BEF to position itself along the Dunkirk perimeter. It was in towns and villages like Le Paradis that British regiments made their stand against the rested panzer divisions, now reinforced by Waffen-SS formations such as Totenkopf. Their obstinate defense, fierce as it was, could not stop the panzers, but they slowed them. More crucially, they also started to bleed them white. Totenkopf Division, for instance, lost almost 700 men in their attempts to dislodge the Royal Norfolk Regiment from Le Paradis and a few nearby villages. German generals began to wonder if taking Dunkirk was worth crippling the elite panzer divisions, which would soon be needed on the Somme front against the reforming French line. One might note that the British were committing everything they could get their hands on to these fights. That point was made in a village just to the north of Le Paradis, Epinette, where Captain John Churchill, aka Mad Jack Churchill, armed with only a bow and a few arrows, stalked a German patrol. His first shot hit a German infantryman square in the chest, and his mates soon dispatched the rest of them, using slightly more modern weapons. So the English longbow, made famous at Crecy, Poitiers, and Agincourt 600 years earlier, had, probably for the final time on a British battlefield, made its presence felt. In Le Paradis itself, the 2nd Norfolks held a farmhouse until it was destroyed by mortar and artillery fire. Retreating to a cowshed, the battalion fought on until the ammunition was gone. The 99 survivors had the misfortune to surrender to the SS soldiers of Totenkopf Division, which marched them a short way down the road, and after lining them up near a barn, opened fire on them with 2 machine guns. One of the 2 survivors described the massacre as follows. We turned off the dusty French road, through a gateway and into a meadow beside the buildings of a farm. I saw, with one of the nastiest feelings I have ever had in my life, 2 heavy machine guns inside the meadow, pointing at the head of our column. The guns began to spit fire. For a few seconds, the cries and shrieks of our stricken men drowned the cackling of the guns. Men fell like grass before a scythe. I felt a searing pain and pitched forward. My scream of pain mingled with the cries of my mates, But even before I fell into the heap of dying men, the thought stabbed my brain, if I ever get out of here, the swine that did this will pay for it. Forlorn hopes though they may have been, but dozens of lonely braves stands in towns with names long forgotten, Asbrook, Merville, Epinette, Esther. They bought time for the remaining forces of the BEF and about a third of the 1st French Army to retreat into the rapidly forming perimeter. In Dunkirk, nobody was ready for the avalanche of men and materiel that was converging upon the city from all points of the compass. I'm standing in front of Bastion 32, built in 1874 as part of a general strengthening of France's coastal defences. Today it houses a museum dedicated to telling the story of the defence and evacuation of Dunkirk, but in 1940, Bastion 32 served as the headquarters of Admiral Jean Abrial, who was the overall commander of the French coast. As he attempted to make sense of the chaos around him, Abrial remained under the impression that the British intended to hold Dunkirk as a permanent foothold onto the continent. It was not until Lord Gort's representative, General Ronald Adam, arrived on the 27th of May that he glimpsed the truth. The British were leaving. In fact, Gort had ordered Adam to follow Abrial's orders, but in doing so, he had handed him a loophole big enough to drive a cruiser through. It was, quote, as long as those orders did not imperil the safety and welfare of British troops, unquote. As far as Adam was concerned, pretty much every order emanating from Bastion 32 ran counter to the safety and welfare of British troops. Despite this, Admiral Abrial and General Bertrand Forgald, the commander of the French troops within the Dunkirk perimeter, maintained their headquarters here until the 4th of June, when they departed with their staffs just before the Germans arrived. As the British defensive positions buckled under the weight of the German onslaught, a fresh crisis arose on the eastern defensive line when Belgium, with basically no warning at all, surrendered and its army laid down its arms. Ypres was the scene of some of the most horrific fighting of the First World War, and in 1940 it marked the left flank of the retreating BEF. With the Belgians out of the war, the success of the Dunkirk evacuation rested on what would happen there the next 24 hours, and the crisis was great indeed. As Churchill later recorded, suddenly, without prior consultation, with the least possible notice, without the advice of his ministers and upon his own personal act, he, i.e. Leopold, sent a plenipotentiary to the German command, surrendered the army, and exposed our whole flank and means of retreat. Or, as Lord Gort later stated, I now found myself suddenly faced with an open gap of about 20 miles between Ypres and the sea, through which enemy armoured forces might reach the beaches. In not much more than a twinkling, the Belgian army had vanished from the scene. As the Belgian army drew its last breaths before its surrender, along the Comines Canal, several miles south of Ypres, General Harold Franklin's 5th Division took up its positions. Its mission was clear: stop an onrushing German corps 3 times its strength. In a series of seesaw confrontations of attack and counterattack, 5th Division, along with elements of the 1st and 4th, held the line all the way through the 27th. And it was the same story on the 28th, as the exhausted British regiments, supported by heavy artillery posted all along the Messines-Vichata Ridge, grimly held positions along the small waterway against increasingly heavy odds. On the night of the 28th and 29th of May, the 5th Division was told to pull back, and the exhausted troops retreated in good order back into the Dunkirk perimeter. The stand had, at great cost, bought the necessary time for General Montgomery to move the 3rd Division 25 miles, passing behind Franklin's troops to link up with a few retreating French units. Together they occupied the gap between Ypres and the sea. It was a close-run thing, as Montgomery had to defend the final 10 miles to the sea with a makeshift force of mechanics, clerks, and transport drivers, most of them having just recently armed themselves with Belgian weapons which were then littering the roads. Against all odds, Montgomery's 3rd Division and Franklin's 5th Division held long enough for 4 British divisions still south of the Lys River to filter through a narrowing gap to the relative safety of the Dunkirk perimeter. As the British desperately fought to hold back the nearly 30 divisions of General Fedor von Bock's Army Group B, the scattered regiments and battalions holding the strong points on the western side of the Dunkirk defences grimly clung to their positions and fought their isolated battles. Here at Wormhout, the 144th Brigade, part of the 48th South Midland Division, held off Guderian's panzers all day on the 27th and for most of the 28th. Finally surrounded, out of supplies as well as ammunition, the troops defending this small village were forced to surrender. As at Le Paradis, they had the misfortune of surrendering to the SS. On this occasion, the Lebensstadt Adolf Hitler Regiment. The POWs, mostly from the 2nd Warwicks, were taken to a small barn in La Plaine Bois, where 100 of them were herded into the small enclosure and then stick grenades were thrown in after them. Because Sergeant Stanley Moore and CSM Augustus Jennings sacrificed themselves by jumping on the grenades, casualties were, at first, light. But then the frustrated Germans opened up with rifles and machine gun fire. When it was over, all but 6 of the British were dead or fatally wounded. We are now 8 miles south of Wormhout at the town of Kassel, the Gibraltar of the Western defensive line, and it's easy to see why given the flat terrain surrounding this hill. For 3 days, soldiers from 145th Brigade defended this position, which they had turned into a makeshift fortress by punching firing holes through the town's medieval walls. Surrounded, under incessant Stuka attack, and battered by mortars and artillery, the 2nd Gloucesters and the 4th Oxen Bucks, in a true contest of wills, repelled repeated panzer assaults. On the 28th of May alone, British gunners firing their artillery and anti-tank guns through the newly created loopholes knocked out 40 precious panzers. The 145th Brigade held these positions until the 30th of May, when they were finally given permission to withdraw into the perimeter. Unfortunately, it was too late for most of them, and in a series of running battles during the night of the 30th, most of the brigade was destroyed. But their gallant stand had saved the BEF. Soon thereafter, almost all of the German tanks were withdrawn from the line and sent south and west for further attacks on the new French defensive line, Operation Fall Rot. As the battered and exhausted BEF divisions took their positions in the Dunkirk perimeter, they still had a hard fight ahead of them, but it would be mostly against German infantry, and thus a much fairer contest. The race to Dunkirk was over, and the British had won it by the narrowest of margins. The next race will be to see how many troops could be gotten off the beaches before the Germans exterminated the pocket. While the soldiers manning the constantly shrinking perimeter defensive strove to hold back the advancing German infantry, the Royal Navy, assisted by a few French vessels, a Polish one, and from the 31st until the 4th of June by many hundreds of small civilian craft that had answered the government's pleas for help, worked tirelessly to get as many of the BEF men off the beaches as possible. First predictions were glum, and few expected to get more than 45,000 of the BEF back to Britain. In fact, by the 27th of May, only a disappointing 7,669 men had been lifted off the beaches. De Panne today is a rather pretty little Belgian town by the seaside, right on the border with France. In 1940 it was the location of Lord Gort's last headquarters in a villa formerly used by King Leopold. When Lord Gort arrived at his headquarters, he did not find very much to make him optimistic. He stated in his official report, "No ships could be unloaded from the docks at Dunkirk and few wounded could be evacuated. There was no water in Dunkirk and very little on the beaches. The naval plants were not yet in full operations, and some 20,000 men were waiting to be lifted off." No one had yet figured into their calculations the determination of the Royal Navy not to abandon the army in its hour of need, the ingenuity of the average soldier who on these beaches created a half-dozen makeshift piers by driving trucks into the surf, or the willingness of thousands of part-time civilian sailors to leave the comforts and safety of their homes to risk all in what must have appeared to be a forlorn hope to save the BEF. When these boats arrived, they were unsure what to expect, but one participant recorded what they found. "The picture will always remain sharp-etched in my memory. The lines of men wearily and sleepily staggering across the beach from the dunes to the shallows, falling into little boats, great columns of men thrust out into the water among the bomb and shell splashes. The foremost ranks were shoulder deep, moving forward under the command of young subalterns, themselves with their heads just a little bit above the waves that rode into the sand. As the front ranks were dragged aboard the boats, the rear ranks moved up, from ankle deep to knee deep to waist deep, until they, too, came to shoulder depth in their turn. The little boats that ferried from the beach to the big ships in deep water listed drunkenly with the weight of the men. The big ships slowly took on lists of their own with the enormous numbers crowded aboard. And always, down the dunes and across the beach came new hordes of men, new columns, new lines. On the beach was a destroyer, bombed and burned. At the water's edge were ambulances, abandoned when their last load had been discharged. There was always the red background, the red of Dunkirk burning. There was no water to check the fires, and there were no men to be spared to fight them. Red, too, were the shell bursts, the flash of guns, the fountains of tracer bullets. The din was infernal. The 5.9 batteries shelled ceaselessly and brilliantly. To the whistle of shells overhead was added the scream of falling bombs. Even the sky was full of noise, anti-aircraft shells, machine gun fire, the snarl of falling planes, the angry hornet noise of dive bombers. One could not speak normally at any time against the roar of it and the noise of our own engines. We all developed Dunkirk throat, a sore hoarseness that was the hallmark of those who had been there. Yet through all the noise, I will always remember the voices of the young subalterns as they sent their men aboard, and I will remember, too, the astonishing discipline of the men. They had fought through 3 weeks of retreat, always falling back without orders, often without support. Transport had failed. They had gone sleepless. They had been without food and water. Yet they kept ranks as they came down the beaches, and they obeyed commands. Without the use of this mole, rebuilt since its destruction in a storm in 1970, only a fraction of the troops evacuated from Dunkirk would have ever escaped France. Realizing that somebody with naval experience would have to control the embarkation, Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding Operation Dynamo in Dover, ordered Captain William G. Tennant to Dunkirk to take charge of loading the troops onto the still assembling rescue fleet. Tennant arrived with a naval shore party of 8 officers and about 160 ratings on the evening of the 27th of May, and immediately set to work. It was quickly clear to him that the Luftwaffe had made evacuation from Dunkirk's ruined harbour, which was still ablaze, completely impossible. But Tennant also noted that by concentrating on keeping the docks out of service, the Luftwaffe had left the 2 moles, the large breakwaters which extended deep into the channel, completely unmolested. The eastern mole alone was 1,400 yards long, constructed of rock with concrete pilings. Moreover, it was topped by a wooden walkway, wide enough for 4 men to walk abreast. Tennant ordered a single ship to come alongside to see if it was possible to load soldiers directly off the mole. In less than 30 minutes, this first vessel was crammed with 950 men, and immediately she set sail for England. The mole worked. More crucially, however, several ships at a time could tie up alongside it. This was the turning point of the embarkation and the BEF's salvation. During the next week, over 200,000 soldiers would be lifted from the Dunkirk moles. As a rule, the British used the eastern mole and the French the western, but given that on the last day of the lift, the only troops to be lifted were the French soldiers who had been holding off the Germans to allow the last of the British to leave the night before, when HMS Shakiri, the last ship to leave Dunkirk, set sail loaded with French troops, she did so from this eastern mole. The British, as recorded in Admiral Ramsay's official report, had expected to save a mere 45,000 men. But by the time the last vessel departed Dunkirk on the 4th of June, some 338,000 had been rescued, 110,000 of which were French. The evacuation had cost some 240 vessels, with another 45 severely damaged. Most grievous was the loss of 6 British destroyers and another 24 damaged, and these will be sorely missed during the upcoming Battle of the Atlantic. But as Admiral Cunningham later said during another evacuation, this time from Crete, it takes the Navy 3 years to build a ship. It will take 300 years to build a new tradition. The evacuation will continue. So that was the story of the perimeter. And in the next video in the series, we're going to be having a look at how the Royal Navy saw things. I'm Nicholas Moran, the Chieftain, and we'll see you on that one.